economist, I've been documenting the rise in inflation over the last couple of years using two metrics, the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, and the PCE, which is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. And a lot of you have asked me why the Federal Reserve prefers to use the PCE over the CPI, even though the CPI is kind of what gets all the news when we talk about the inflation report. Now, while they are both measurements of inflation, and in general, they move in tandem with one another, right? If the CPI is rising, then the PCE is also rising. These two measurements are capturing two different things, right? So the CPI, think about it like measuring the prices of a fixed basket of goods over time. And it assumes that consumers are buying the same items every month. So you go to the grocery store, you buy 2 heads of lettuce, you buy a chicken, you buy milk, you buy eggs, and that doesn't change regardless of what the prices of those goods are. And in some ways, measuring inflation like this is a good thing. When you have a standard amount of products that people are buying day to day, it's very easy to compare last month's prices with this month's prices with what the prices were a few years ago. However, the thing with the CPI is that it ignores some basic behavioral factors of consumers, namely the fact that consumers, if things get too expensive, they might switch to a cheaper alternative. For example, if the price of beef gets to be too expensive and people choose to switch to things like chicken or pork, the CPI doesn't account for that change in quantity because it's only really looking at the changes in price. So it doesn't exactly reflect what consumers and consumer behavior are doing. The CPI also doesn't cover inflation on things like stocks or bonds or real estate, nor does it cover inflation on things like health insurance or Medicare or Medicaid benefits. Now, in contrast, the PCE does capture inflation from things like health insurance. And while it doesn't capture inflation from things like stocks and bonds directly, it does track inflation of things like brokerage fees, which economists can use as a proxy for stock market inflation, right? Because portfolio management and brokerage fees tend to go up as the stock market tends to rise. As I alluded to before, the PCE also accounts for the dynamic pricing effect when consumers switch from one good to another when the price of one good gets to be too expensive. And the other key difference, right, between these two measurements is that the CPI specifically looks at urban consumers. Unlike that, the PCE is also accounting for the change of inflation with non-urban consumers, namely those in rural areas. And due to this, they change the weighting of how much each of their baskets of goods looks at as an overall reflection of inflation and prices, right? So in the CPI, housing accounts for about a third of that basket, but it only accounts for 15% of PCE. And looking at all of this together, right, comparing the PCE and the CPI, the Federal Reserve takes the view that the PCE is what actually reflects the day-to-day reality of inflation for Americans. And when they're thinking about Federal Reserve policy and how to adjust things, that is why they prefer to use the PCE. And how this is generally reflected in the data is that we see inflation be a little bit lower than the CPI. Again, over the next couple months, it will be very interesting to see how inflation pans out, how the PCE, which reflects some of these more everyday realities, changes versus the CPI, given what we've seen with prices lately. But for now, that's all I got. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know.